The cherry tomato was still warm in my palm when I heard the footsteps approaching. I froze behind Margaret Chen's prize-winning rose bushes, clutching my phone's flashlight between my teeth, wondering how exactly I'd explain to my husband why I was crouched in a neighbor's garden at 11:47 p.m., wearing my dead mother's trench coat. It had all started 3 months ago, with what I thought was an innocent compliment. "Your front garden looks absolutely lovely this year, Margaret," I'd said over the fence that separated our pristine Willowbrook Estates properties. I was the HOA president. After all, it was my duty to acknowledge good landscaping. Margaret had smiled that infuriating smile of hers, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Thank you, Linda. I've been trying some new varieties." New varieties. If only I'd known then what I know now. The first sign something was amiss came during my weekly neighborhood patrol. I'd been documenting Mrs. Peterson's continued violation of the no lawn ornaments exceeding 18 inches rule when I noticed something odd about Margaret's flower bed. Hidden behind her spectacular display of marigolds and petunias, I could have sworn I saw something green and leafy that didn't quite belong. I dismissed it initially. Margaret Chen was, unfortunately, a model resident. In my 3 years as HOA president, she'd never received a single violation notice. Her grass was exactly 2.5 inches high, her mailbox was Regulation Hunter Green No. 47, and her seasonal flower displays had actually been featured in the Willowbrook Estates newsletter twice. But the more I looked, the more suspicious I became. It started with casual drive-bys during my morning coffee runs. Then I began timing my daily walks to coincide with Margaret's schedule. She worked from home as some sort of graphic designer, which made surveillance challenging, but I was nothing if not persistent. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday. I was pretending to check my mailbox for the 4th time that day when Margaret's sprinkler system malfunctioned, soaking her front garden and revealing what I'd suspected all along. Tomatoes. Cherry tomatoes, to be exact. At least a dozen plants cleverly concealed behind her flower border. My hands shook as I photographed the evidence through my kitchen window with my phone's zoom feature. This was it, the violation that would finally knock St. Margaret off her pedestal. Section 14.3 of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Covenant clearly stated, "Front yard landscaping shall consist exclusively of ornamental plants, flowers, and approved decorative elements. Vegetable gardens, fruit trees, and edible plants are strictly prohibited in areas visible from the street." I spent the rest of the day crafting the perfect violation notice, cross-referencing regulations, and consulting my HOA handbook. This wasn't just about enforcement, this was about principle. If we started allowing vegetables in front yards, what was next? Chickens? Clotheslines? The complete breakdown of property values and neighborhood standards? But when I hand-delivered the notice the next morning, Margaret's reaction wasn't what I expected. She invited me in for tea. "Linda," she said, setting down delicate china cups in her spotless kitchen, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." I pulled out my phone, ready to present my photographic evidence. "The tomato plants in your front garden are a clear violation of—" "What tomato plants?" Margaret's expression was genuinely confused. I showed her the photos. Margaret studied them carefully, then smiled that maddening smile again. "Oh, those. Linda, those aren't tomato plants. They're ornamental cherry tomato plants. Completely different thing. They're grown purely for their decorative value, the way the fruit clusters hang, the lovely green foliage. I never actually eat them." I stared at her. "But they're still tomatoes." "Ornamental tomatoes," she corrected gently. "Like ornamental peppers or decorative gourds. Perfectly within the guidelines for ornamental plants." This was when I should have walked away. A reasonable person would have accepted the explanation, maybe even admired Margaret's creative interpretation of the rules. But I wasn't feeling particularly reasonable. I spent the next week researching ornamental versus edible tomatoes, consulting gardening websites, and even calling the county extension office. The more I learned, the more frustrated I became. Margaret wasn't technically wrong, but she wasn't exactly right either. That's when the surveillance began in earnest. I started documenting Margaret's daily routine. She watered her front garden every morning at 7 a.m. and again in the evening at 6 p.m. She tended to her plants on weekends, always wearing those ridiculous oversized gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured her face. But I was patient. I was thorough. And eventually my persistence paid off. It happened on a Thursday evening. I was stationed at my upstairs bedroom window with my husband's bird-watching binoculars when I saw it. Margaret plucking one of her ornamental tomatoes and popping it directly into her mouth.
Gotcha.
I fumbled for my phone, but by the time I'd opened the camera app, she'd moved behind her rose bushes. I needed clear evidence. I needed proof that would hold up in an HOA board meeting, which is how I found myself crouched in Margaret's garden at nearly midnight, wearing my mother's old detective novels-inspired trench coat, trying to gather photographic evidence of consumption. The footsteps were getting closer. I held my breath and pressed myself deeper into the shadow of the rose bushes, thorns catching on the fabric of my coat. "Linda?" I froze. It was Margaret's voice, coming from directly above me. "Linda, what are you doing in my garden?" There was no point in hiding now. I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my knees and trying to maintain what remained of my dignity. "I was investigating a potential HOA violation," I said, attempting to sound official. Margaret stood on her front porch in a bathrobe, arms crossed, looking more amused than angry. "By hiding in my bushes at midnight?" "I saw you eating the tomatoes," I said, pulling out my phone. "I have evidence." "You have evidence of me eating tomatoes from my own garden?" "Your front garden, which violates the ornamental plant clause if you're actually consuming." Margaret laughed. Actually laughed. "Linda, come inside. We need to talk." 15 minutes later, I was sitting in Margaret's kitchen again, this time with a cup of chamomile tea and a growing sense that I'd made a terrible mistake. "Linda," Margaret said gently, "I grow those tomatoes because they make me happy. They remind me of my grandmother's garden back in Taiwan. I planted them in the front yard so she could see them from heaven." I stared into my teacup. "The HOA rules are important," Margaret continued, "but sometimes there are things more important than rules, like memories, and kindness, and understanding that maybe someone's small joy isn't worth turning into a war." She paused, then smiled, and this time it did reach her eyes. "Besides, I checked with a lawyer friend. Ornamental plants that happen to be edible don't violate the covenant, especially if their primary purpose is decorative. I could grow ornamental kale, if I wanted to." I looked up at her. "Ornamental kale? Very trendy. Comes in purple." Despite everything, I found myself almost smiling. The next morning, I withdrew the violation notice. At the following HOA board meeting, I proposed a new initiative, a neighborhood garden tour to showcase creative landscaping solutions. Margaret's front garden was our first stop. I never did eat one of her tomatoes, but she gives me vegetables from her backyard garden now, the one that was always perfectly legal and that I never bothered to notice during all my surveillance. The trench coat went back in the closet, though I kept it. Sometimes we all need a reminder of our capacity for getting completely carried away. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get neighbors patient enough to help you find your way back to sanity, one cherry tomato at a time.